Let's talk mobilization. Whenever you need to get ready for war, you need to mobilize. You need to get people together. You need to get your troops ready. You need to get weapons ready. You need to get everything going. And when you're at war with yourself, you have to mobilize with what you've got. And we know that the Confederacy lacks a lot of industrialization. So they have to mobilize differently than the North. And one of the things the Confederacy does is institute a military draft in April of 1862. Remember, we're at that stalemate, and now they've started to push forward again. They need to enlist more people. So under the Confederacy's military draft, all men between the ages of 18 and 35 must serve for 3 years in the Confederate Army. But if you are wealthy enough, you can send a substitute that you have paid to take your place. Capitalism. It's great. The Confederate government also takes over the economy of the South to create infrastructure and produce weapons of war. This is something you find a lot, actually. You'll find this in World War I, you'll find this in World War II, and we're back as a union. Spoilers. But the Confederacy has to take over the infrastructure because they need to produce weapons because they can't buy them from the North anymore. We've blockaded them, and Britain and France are not really trading with them, even though they are sympathetic to their cause. They're not doing a great job of trading because their money is not that valuable. This includes, under mobilization for the South, this includes them taking over the enslaved people from their enslavers to put them to work on war projects. As you can imagine, this makes some of the enslavers very angry because they need their enslavers to harvest their fields and to run their houses and to do everything that they are not doing. And if you take them to run the war effort, what are they supposed to do? They couldn't possibly work for themselves. President Davis is also given the right to suspend habeas corpus, which essentially means that there is no due process anymore. Anyone can be arrested and detained without going in front of a judge, without receiving a trial. It is pretty common in times of war for something like this that you would find this. But again, it makes people upset because that's a little bit federal government-y, right? That's a little interfering. We didn't want that. That's why we left the Union. But sometimes, as the South finds out, maybe the federal government has to do certain things that you're going to have to go along with if you want to win the war, right? So, the Confederate government will not tax their people. So that's a win, right? Maybe we don't have habeas corpus anymore, but we're not paying taxes. High five, everybody. Great. But instead of taxing their people, they just print more money. And if you know anything about money, you can't just print more of it because it makes the money that's there worthless or worth less, right? So by printing more money, this leads to aggressive inflation, which means that food costs more, which means that people are hungry, which means that people start to riot. And you can't use the food on your plantations because your enslavers have been taken by the military to go work for them. So you got to harvest your own potatoes, like, questionable. And again, Britain and France did not come through for the Confederacy the way they had hoped. Britain and France rely on trade with the United States, and they're not going to take away all the manufacturing trade that they've got up in the North to trade for some cotton down in the South. It's just not going to work. And because it's so difficult for Britain and France to break through those blockades to get to the South for trading, they're not going to put in the effort. Britain goes to India. They need cotton. They've got colonies in India. They go to India and get their cotton, which leaves the South alone and overvalued. And this is obviously what Abraham Lincoln wanted in the first place, but it took a couple of years to even get to the point where you started to question if the South could hold on. The Confederacy citizens start to dissent among themselves. Politicians start to disagree with how much power the states should have. People start to resent President Davis's conscriptions and the attempts that he does make to tax to raise money bring more resentment. Poor whites start to become more resentful of the wealthy because the wealthy have the ability to buy their way out of the draft, and racial tensions are continuing to grow throughout the Confederacy. But the Union has its own problems with mobilizing. It's not like the Union's doing things much better, right? The Union government takes control over certain areas of citizens' lives as well. They enact new taxes. The Confederacy doesn't enact any, the Union enacts more. They make new contracts with different suppliers of food, weapons, and other needed materials. So if you're wealthy in the North, you're making government money now. Again, they emphasize free labor instead of enslaved labor, but that doesn't make it much better for anybody who has to be forced to work. They also passed the Land Grant Act in 1862, which is also known as the Morrill Act. This is fundamental to this idea of free labor. It is providing land and $30,000 for agricultural colleges that can be created in each state in the Union, and they will be funded by federal funds. Now, the idea is that we don't need to rely on the South, right? And we don't need to rely on people. If we make agricultural colleges, we can use the agricultural outputs from those colleges to fund our food and all of that stuff. And they also tax the wealthy. The North is going to implement higher tariffs and bring back our national banks. They're going to pass 2 national banks acts to help pay for the war. Again, that doesn't mean that things are going much better in the North. The money is worth more, but people are still not happy. The government issues war bonds to increase money to pay for the war. And they also issue greenbacks, which are going to be the national currency. But a year later, in 1863, the Union also has to draft. They also turn to conscription. So things are not so much better in the North that they are winning outright. By 1863, the North has to conscript men to fill the needs of the military, and they pass the Enrollment Act. The Enrollment Act requires all unmarried men from age 20 to 25 and married men aged 35 to 45 to join the Union Army. This act, unlike the South, includes immigrants who had filed for citizenship. That doesn't mean they had gotten citizenship yet, but if you had come to America and you had filed for citizenship, you were now required to register for the Union Army. And their members would be selected by a lottery system, and whoever came out of that lottery was sent to fight. They also had a loophole law. Just like the South, they had that loophole law. You could hire a substitute to replace you, or you could pay $300 to the federal government and get out of the draft. But again, we have to throw it back real quick, that continuity and change over time. Because of the Dred Scott ruling way back before we seceded, Black people were not considered citizens, and therefore they were exempt from the draft. So any Black unit that you learn about and you hear about fighting during the Civil War, they did that on their own willing accord. They were not conscripted. They maybe joined for many, many different reasons. There's thousands of reasons why somebody joins a military. I realize that. But it is important to note that they are not conscripted under law because they're not citizens. They still joined, but they're not the citizen conscription laws that the Irish and the Americans and all the other people in the North had to follow. And just like the South, the North also suspends habeas corpus, and they close down newspapers, the freedom of press under this habeas corpus in the name of national security. We don't want people spreading stories, so you can't run your newspapers anymore. So things are tough for everybody. The North has their way of dealing with it. The South has their way of dealing with it. And you do see a lot of similarities there because you're trying to win the war. And things get worse before they get better. And arguably, do they get better? For some people, sure. But for others, as we go on, you will revisit that some things stay the same and some things don't.